She loved Diddy until she saw the truth. Now, she's his worst nightmare. Jane met Sean Diddy Combs in the kind of setting people fantasize about. Music playing, lights dimmed, a rooftop party in Miami filled with laughter champagne, and the kind of promise that only shows up under neon. He was magnetic, the kind of person whose presence bent the energy of a room. When he looked at her, it felt like permission, like validation, like finally being chosen. She was in her mid-20s, independent, ambitious, navigating the edges of the entertainment industry as a stylist and part-time consultant. He asked her questions, listened when she spoke, laughed at her jokes. It wasn't instant, but it was steady. He made her feel seen. Their first few weeks were blissful. He introduced her to his circle-booked weekend getaways to private islands, surprised her with designer bags she never asked for. At first it felt surreal, almost cinematic. She told friends it was like stepping into someone else's life, and for a while she was okay living in that dream. But then the rules started to appear. They didn't come all at once, just in the little things. A request that she not wear a certain lipstick color, a correction on how she greeted a friend of his, a warning not to post too many photos of herself without tagging him. Just branding, he said with a smile. She laughed, but she stopped posting. Soon, the distance grew more complicated. He'd go silent for days, then suddenly arrive unannounced and expect warmth. When she asked where he'd been, his response was simple: "Don't worry about what I do when you're not around." That's when the first argument happened. It wasn't loud, it was cold, calculated. She cried. He didn't. But the next day there were flowers, a handwritten note, and an invitation to Turks and Caicos. She forgave him because she wanted to, because she believed this was still love. Over time, those moments multiplied. Private jets and public silence. Gentle gestures followed by sharp words. A cycle she couldn't name yet, but had started to recognize in her own reactions. She would flinch before he touched her, not because he had hit her, but because he could. She began tracking time not by dates, but by moods. Happy weeks came with gifts. Quiet weeks came with tension. Then there were nights when he'd ask her to stay silent while he took phone calls. She would sit in the same room, fully dressed, pretending not to hear the things being said. He began introducing themes into their relationship. Role-play scenarios, some playful, some dark. One day he asked her to pretend she'd cheated on him. She laughed it off. "I'm serious," he said. That night he brought another man into the house. Jane didn't know his name. Diddy called it a test of loyalty. She froze. Froze in the moment. Froze in the silence afterward. The next morning she found an envelope with $10,000 on the nightstand. No note, no explanation. She didn't ask. She just cried in the shower. That was the night she started writing things down. In the back of a drawer, beneath a case of makeup brushes, she kept a notebook. Small, black, plain. She wrote the date, the description, how she felt, what music was playing, what he wore, where she hid her phone. It became her ritual, not to heal, but to remember, because when things were good again, when he cooked for her, when he whispered apologies, she would question whether the bad had happened at all. But the notebook always reminded her. The entries became more frequent, more vivid. March 3rd. He called it a game, said if I loved him, I'd trust him. Then he brought in Anton. I didn't speak, I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and tried to disappear. April 19th, I told him I was tired. He laughed. Said tired rhymes with fired. I'm not even an employee. May 6th. He apologized again, said it was stress. Said the industry makes him numb. I kissed him anyway. I don't know why. She kept working, kept smiling, kept showing up at parties and events. She learned how to wear sunglasses indoors to hide the bags under her eyes. She mastered the art of polite silence. The world saw her as lucky, as chosen, as the one who had everything. Inside she was vanishing. Friends asked questions, slowly, carefully. "You okay? Just tired," she'd say. No one pushed. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they did, and just didn't know how to help. He started pushing boundaries more boldly, asking her to do things she didn't want to do, suggesting she attend gatherings where phones were banned, where guests didn't use their real names, where people laughed too hard at things that weren't funny. One night, she found herself in a room with blackout curtains, no clocks, and a speaker playing ambient music on a loop. She wasn't alone. But she wasn't really there either. She floated through the experience like a shadow, detached, compliant, silent. When it was over, he said she'd passed another test. She didn't ask what kind. Back in her apartment, she stared at herself in the mirror for a long time, not to admire, just to remember who she was, who she used to be, before him. That was the night she wrote, "I'm not afraid of him hitting me. I'm afraid of him convincing me I deserved it." The notebook was no longer just a record. It was a tether, a lifeline, the one place where her truth still lived. But it wouldn't stay secret for long, because someone else had started writing too, a former assistant, a man named David James. And when the stories began to overlap, when Jane's private entries matched David's receipts, timestamps, and observations, it stopped being anecdotal. It became evidence, and that was the beginning of the end. David James hadn't planned to stay long. He was hired as an executive assistant, a temporary gig. He told himself a stepping stone on the way to something less demanding, less blurry. But 6 months turned into 6 years, and by then he wasn't just part of the schedule. He was part of the silence. He remembered the onboarding process like it was a scene from a movie, a short video on a tablet, a non-disclosure agreement thicker than a Bible, a verbal reminder, discretion is everything. At first it all felt exciting, jet-setting schedules, late-night calls from studios with no names, luxury cars, spontaneous trips, private chefs. He carried 3 phones, one for official calls, one for tracking logistics, one only Diddy used. He saw everything, but said nothing, because that's what they were trained to do. He scheduled flights with guest aliases. He booked studio sessions labeled therapy. He hand-delivered sealed envelopes with no names and no receipts. Sometimes it was cash, sometimes instructions, sometimes just a time and a room number. What unnerved him wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't. Women would arrive alone, no luggage, no clear explanation. Some smiled like they were trying to remember why they said yes. Others didn't speak at all. When he asked questions, subtle ones, the answer was always the same. Not your lane. But the moment that broke him wasn't loud. It wasn't even violent. It was a Tuesday afternoon in a house with more windows than walls. He walked past a room and saw Jane sitting on the edge of a couch, clutching her phone like it was the last solid thing in the world. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at the floor. 10 minutes later, she was laughing in the kitchen, sipping tea, making small talk with guests. That was when he knew whatever was happening wasn't sudden. It was systemic. He began taking notes. Quietly, coded, hidden in the margins of logistics spreadsheets and flight logs. When he filed expenses, he included phantom purchases, things that didn't exist, covering gaps for moments he knew were better left unspoken. In 2023, a guest collapsed in one of the private suites during a gathering. No ambulance was called. 2 assistants carried her to a back room. Jane wasn't there that night, but David was. He stood in the hallway while someone said, "She'll be fine. Don't escalate." He couldn't shake the image, the girl barely conscious mascara streaked down her cheek, her hand still clutching one high heel like it mattered. After that, David backed up his notes to a drive. Not to expose, just to preserve. Because part of him still wasn't sure what was happening, and part of him knew exactly what was. He wasn't brave. He didn't leave with a dramatic speech. He just asked to transition out quietly. He trained his replacement, wiped his phones, and waited. Until 2025 when a knock came. It was federal. They had questions. He had receipts. And then something strange happened. They showed him Jane's journal. redacted, typed, but unmistakably hers. Page after page matched his own notes. Same dates, same rooms, same playlist, same gaps. He sat in silence, then said, "I'm ready." When David took the stand, he didn't speak like a whistleblower. He spoke like someone reporting an earthquake that everyone else had pretended not to feel. Calm, controlled. But every sentence landed like an aftershock. He testified about coded language, about staff trained to handle guest discomfort with rehearsed lines, about Studio B being reserved for private testing, about scent programming dimmed lighting psychological reset rooms. He didn't point fingers, he traced systems, and every point matched Jane's record. The courtroom didn't erupt. It went still, the kind of stillness where truth settles before anyone dares to speak. That was the moment the case shifted, from allegation to architecture, from one woman's pain to a structure designed to hide it. Jane never saw David again after she left. But in court, when she heard his name, she whispered under her breath, he remembered. After David's testimony, there was no turning back, not for the court, not for the press, and certainly not for Jane, because suddenly everything she had once tried to forget every soundless night, every wordless command was being spoken aloud by someone else. And then came the others. They didn't storm the courtroom. They arrived like echoes. Former drivers, private chefs, event coordinators, a studio cleaner who signed a non-disclosure years ago and had never told anyone what she saw. One by one, they added weight to the truth, but it was the testimony of a woman named Mia that changed the room. Mia wasn't part of the original complaint. She came forward after the media coverage when Jane's entries started trending anonymously online. She didn't want money. She didn't want exposure. She just wanted the shaking in her hands to stop. She had stayed in the same house. She had been in the same hallway with the black curtains. She remembered the sound the lights made when they dimmed automatically, how the playlist never skipped, how the assistants always said the same thing, relax. This is normal. She testified about being invited to a retreat, told it would help her career. She arrived, signed papers she didn't read, and was led to a room where there were no windows. There, she said, she lost track of time, not from drugs, but from disorientation. "I don't think he wanted to hurt us," she said softly. "I think he wanted us to not matter." The gallery didn't move. Even the defense didn't object. Mia described a corridor lined with mirrors that didn't reflect properly, of meals delivered on trays where no one made eye contact, of a moment when she reached for her phone only to find it had been replaced with a note, "Trust is freedom." She described a door with no handle, a chair bolted to the floor, music that never stopped. She described trying to leave only to find her driver changed, the car silent, the route unclear, but she never reported it because she had signed the paper, because she thought she had agreed. "I didn't know how to explain it," Mia said. "How do you say I was free to go, but also I never could?" The prosecutor nodded. "You said you recognized parts of Jane's writing." Which parts? Mia turned to the jury, the towels, the candles, the silence. From that moment on, the case stopped being about isolated stories. It became a map. Each witness marked a location, a date, a pattern. One remembered the layout of Studio B. Another mentioned a code name used for late-night bookings. Someone else recalled buying specific brands of oil and fragrance labeled event only. Even the defense struggled to keep up. They began shifting strategies, from denial to deflection. From that never happened to, if it did, it wasn't criminal. But the weight of repetition became its own kind of evidence. And then came the photos. They weren't loud, they weren't violent, but they shifted the air in the courtroom. Homeland Security, working alongside the federal team, brought them out slowly, like puzzle pieces they already knew would fit. Over 100 images collected through court-authorized raids, old staff hard drives, cloud syncs that had gone dormant for years. They began with the innocuous, a receipt. Not just any receipt, but one for blackout curtains, 4 identical sets purchased in bulk, all matching the exact brand and dimensions Jane described in her journal. The date on the invoice matched an entry. Everything went dark at once. Then came a photo of a mirror, ordinary to most until an investigator pointed to the corner. A cluster of nearly invisible dots, infrared, surveillance grade. The kind of feature you wouldn't notice unless you knew to look. Jane had written, "There are eyes in the walls. I feel them blink." Another photo, a logbook entry from house staff. One line stood out, 2:41 a.m. Guest 3F unresponsive. Initiated heatstroke protocol. Studio B cleared. The timestamp matched an audio file recovered from David James's folder, the sound of a door slamming, followed by silence, then the low hum of a cooling unit powering on, then the chart, a seating chart. Nothing dramatic at first glance, but zoomed in, it was a map of intentionality. Rows of initials, color-coded tags, even marks next to names, some starred, some circled, and then 3 names handwritten next to the letter B, Studio B. Jane's line from her journal returned like a wave. If your name had a B, you didn't sleep. The image stayed projected for over a minute. No one interrupted, not even the defense. Because in that stillness, something crystallized. This wasn't spontaneous. It was structured. One of the agents, Special Investigator Hall, offered commentary. Calmly, almost clinically. These annotations appear on multiple charts across 2 years. The B designation is unique to only one subset of guests, those who arrived after midnight and were retrieved before 6 a.m., never seen at public events. There was no need for graphic content. The design alone told a story. The defense shifted uncomfortably. When cross-examination began, they tried to blur the implications. Could these have been innocent? Perhaps Hall said. But taken with the pattern of isolation timing and removal of phones, it's not likely. Could your interpretation be incorrect? He didn't smile. You don't need interpretation when the logistics align with the journal of a woman who never saw these charts. The defense tried reframing. Some of these guests didn't, they signed NDAs. Yes, Hall replied. Which tells us more about control than consent. The courtroom was quiet again, heavier but sharper. Meanwhile, Jane didn't speak. She didn't react. Her shoulders were still, her eyes steady. Her hand clutched the black notebook in her lap, not to write, not anymore. Just to feel something familiar in a space that was finally becoming real. Sometimes her fingers tensed. Sometimes her grip loosened, but she never let go. Because the book wasn't just paper. It was memory, proof. Her voice before anyone else believed it mattered. And now the room did believe. They had the evidence. They had the maps. They had the silences and the space between them. And for once that was enough. The next day the courtroom felt different. Not tense, not quiet, just aware. The kind of atmosphere that follows a realization too heavy to unsee. Jane sat in the same seat. The notebook still rested on her lap. But the weight in the room had shifted from doubt to gravity. The prosecution called their next witness, an operations manager identified only as T. His name was redacted, his face blurred in media sketches. He had worked behind the scenes for years, hired to streamline logistics for private events. He didn't arrive with flair, no suit, no grand statement. Just a quiet presence, a stack of emails, and something most others had lacked: a logbook. T had kept records, not digital, not traceable, but handwritten notes hidden between fake invoices and travel itineraries. He began simply, "I was told not to ask questions, but that didn't mean I didn't have them." His first assignment was in 2019, a quiet weekend retreat in Turks and Caicos. On paper, it sounded like luxury 30 high-profile guests, beachside villas, private chefs, full security. But what caught his attention even on day one was what wasn't included in the orientation. There were no personal details, just initials on laminated check-in cards, no phone numbers. No emergency contact forms, just 2 columns on a clipboard, checked in and cleared, a box to mark arrival, another to confirm departure. But not everyone had a check in both. T was new then, green eager, paid well enough not to ask questions. His job was straightforward, manage environmental logistics. That meant towels folded a certain way, oils restocked in designated rooms, specific sound frequencies played in specific wings. But as the hours wore on and the sun dipped below the waterline, the instructions started to shift into something else. He was told to maintain ambiance. At first he thought that meant keeping guests comfortable, but the more he saw, the more silent exchanges he witnessed between assistants and security, the more he noticed how lighting was adjusted to conceal more than it revealed, the more he began to understand. Ambiance wasn't about comfort, it was about control. It was about making discomfort feel like part of the experience. Part of the design, intentional. He paused once during his testimony, his voice steady, but his eyes searching the room. Then he turned toward Jane, sitting in her quiet corner with the notebook on her lap. "We never spoke," he said, his voice softening. "But I saw you there, more than once. You were always polite, always composed, but distant, like you were performing a version of yourself that you didn't believe in anymore." Jane didn't flinch, didn't respond verbally, but for the first time in hours she acknowledged someone on the stand with a slow, almost imperceptible nod. That was all. T's account became sharper from there. He began listing operational terms that had once sounded technical, almost bureaucratic, but now in context carried an entirely different weight. Tier 1 prep referred to blackout curtains being drawn early, cooling systems adjusted ambient lighting, softened to specific temperature ranges. Stage 2 meant the introduction of a scent diffuser protocol and red bulb indicators outside certain guest doors. Silence protocol, he explained, wasn't metaphorical. It was a command, a signal that staff should clear a floor immediately, leave their comms in the drop boxes, and avoid returning until given clearance. The defense rose, objection, speculation and interpretation. The judge didn't hesitate. "He may continue." T continued. He described the night that finally shifted something in him, a girl probably in her early 20s. Not on any list he recognized, who appeared disoriented near the staff hallway around 3:00 a.m. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't hysterical. She was barefoot, clutching her heels to her chest, walking like her feet had given up before her mind could catch up. When he gently asked if she was all right, she didn't answer at first. She looked around past him toward the walls like she was checking for eyes. Then she whispered, "I don't want to be next." That line hung in the air longer than any cross-examination ever could. Security arrived within minutes. No one shouted, no one restrained her. They simply guided her away, firmly but calmly. He never saw her again, not the next morning, not on any of the follow-up assignments. When he reviewed the master sheet later, her initials weren't on it. That night, T went to his car. He pulled out the folder he kept under the seat where he'd hidden old guest memos and discarded schedules, and for the first time he made a full copy of the guest roster. Not to leak, not even to challenge, just to remember. In court he pulled out that same list, now yellowed at the edges but still intact. He handed it to the prosecution without drama. The team cross-referenced it with Jane's private journal entries. 2 names on his list were circled. Jane had described them months earlier in entries like the girl with the silver anklet they sent her home early, but she never packed. Green hoodie, gone before sunrise. No one said goodbye. Those names matched. 2 girls, 1 system, multiple witnesses, and now documentation. No outburst followed, no applause. Just the quiet, unmistakable sound of everyone in the courtroom beginning to understand what they were really looking at: a machine, and the parts that made it run. The defense tried to spin him as paranoid. "You admit none of this proves a crime." T didn't flinch. "I admit I didn't have the whole picture, but I knew enough to be afraid of it." The gallery didn't move, neither did the judge. because something was happening. The system wasn't just being questioned, it was looking back. The final witness that afternoon was a therapist, not one who treated Jane, not one hired by the defense, but someone subpoenaed after being referenced in an anonymous hotline complaint. She spoke about the patterns of coercive environments, the difference between consent and conditioned compliance. You can smile and still be scared, she said. You can say yes because the alternative is worse. She didn't mention Jane, but every word traced her outline. When asked about recovery, she said, "It doesn't start when you leave. It starts when you're believed." Jane's grip on her notebook tightened. The court adjourned. Outside, the headlines spun faster. Logbooks, guest lists, tactical silence. Studio B trended again, but inside, the people who mattered weren't chasing views. They were chasing truth. And the next day would bring something none of them expected, a returned envelope, unopened, addressed only to whoever still thinks this was normal. The longer the trial went on, the more it became about what wasn't visible, the missing names, the redacted statements, the line items on budgets that didn't have categories. There were stories, yes, but more haunting than that, there were shadows. Names that came up once and then disappeared. Faces that were blurred not by media policy but because no one could find them anymore. Ben Chu had been in many courtrooms before. He'd defended icons, dismantled tabloid myths, even redirected the momentum of cases that once seemed like open and shut disasters. But this trial was different. He once described it privately to a colleague as trying to reassemble a mirror after it's been stepped on. Each piece told the story, but none on its own could capture the full reflection. Every day in court added another shard, a new angle, a fresh wound. By the end of week 6, the courtroom itself had changed. The people inside weren't reacting to testimony with gasps anymore. There was no novelty left, no disbelief. The jurors didn't lean forward, they leaned in, not out of curiosity but out of dread. They had come to expect that every new exhibit, every voice on the stand, would reinforce what they already feared. This was not chaos. This was choreography. This wasn't the aftermath of spontaneous abuse. It was an architecture of control, and for the first time that word system began to settle into the public lexicon like dust on marble. That week, the prosecution called a witness whose presence immediately altered the courtroom's dynamic. His name was redacted, his identity blurred in sketches and sealed transcripts, but the court referred to him as M, a security consultant, ex-military, sharp suit, tight posture, minimal words. He didn't speak unless prompted, and when he did, the room adjusted itself to his tone. M hadn't been part of the inner circle. He was a contractor. He'd been brought on for a block of work in 2020, 3 months, overseeing operations during a wave of private events. Palm Springs in July, Vegas, in August the Caribbean in September. A whirlwind contract, but well paid and, as he put it, deceptively clean on paper. But what he witnessed during those months had never left him. Phones were always collected, he said. Voice, steady eyes, focused somewhere past the prosecutor's head. No exceptions. We were told to make it standard, normal, just part of the guest experience. Did guests ever ask why the prosecutor asked? Sometimes. We had a line ready. You're here to disconnect. Trust the moment. Did that strike you as unusual? At first, no. Then I noticed we logged arrivals, but not exits. What does that mean exactly? We had to confirm when someone entered the premises. Every guest badge scanned in, but no one ever recorded when they left. It was as if departure was optional, administratively invisible.